Lytro, I think, really deserves credit for bringing the idea to the masses. Light fields have been sort of an academic curiosity for a long time. They've sort of like bubbled up in the public consciousness a few times. If we want to cut through the jargon and misapply some terms, we're like, it's holographic imaging, right? It's ways of creating things that are like way more realistic than two-dimensional images. My company's in the process of proving that today's display technology can actually handle light fields. We've got a little demo on the fly. If you are clever, you can generate the light rays that came from the real world and give someone the right view. So I think these are functionally holographic displays, right? They're capable of giving you 6 degrees of freedom imagery, but it does work.
I'm Matt, the organizer of the SF Video Technology Meetup and the Demuxed Conference.
And I'm Steve, creator of Video.js, the open source video player.
And I'm Phil, the director of Media Technologies Engineering at Bright Cove, previously building BBC iPlayer in London.
And you're listening to Demuxed, a podcast for and by engineers working with video.
Demuxed is brought to you by Heavybit, a program dedicated to helping startups take their developer products to market. For more information, visit heavybit.com.
We're always looking for topics, so if you have any suggestions or just want to tell us how wrong we are, you can find us on Twitter at Demuxed.
When we're recording this, we're on the way towards Demuxed 2017. By the time this gets to your phone or browser, Demuxed might already be done. But you can find all the recordings on Twitch and YouTube if that's the case. So go to demuxed.com. You can check out the schedule. If this is before October 5th, when you're hearing this, go buy a ticket and we'll see you in San Francisco. So today, I'm really excited to have Ryan Damm from Visby on. If a member of the SF Video Meetup, you may have heard him. What month was that, Ryan?
Oh God, ages ago, lifetimes ago.
Yeah, probably like 9 years ago at this point. Ryan came and gave a talk at SF Video a few months ago about light fields and what they're working on at Visby and how that interacts with the video industry moving forward. So really excited to have you on the show today, Ryan.
No, thanks for having me.
So why don't you tell everybody a little bit about yourself?
Gosh, where to start? Founded Visby a couple of years ago, kind of looking at the VR space and decided that we needed to have more of like a light field approach, and we can dig into what that means. Before that, I've been just kind of a video guy at various tech and media related startups for a while. Yeah, that's the 10-second version.
So let's start off with a really basic question here. But what exactly are light fields?
Yeah, that's the basic but like $1 million question, right? One I apparently don't get tired of answering. No, at a high level, light fields are a different way of representing imagery, right? In which you keep every single light ray separate, right? So if you imagine all the light that's bouncing around a room, if you keep every single light ray individually separate, you can do interesting things with them. I think the sort of phrase came into popular awareness with the refocusing cameras that Lytro came out with a few years ago, which is one application of this light field approach. But of course, I think there's a lot more that can be done with it. At high level, that's what it is. It's like looking at the statistics of light and light across a large area rather than through the pinhole of a camera.
So when you say the interesting things that can be done with it, what are some easy examples of that? Like I've seen refocusing. Maybe,
yeah, almost all the things you can do with a light field that are interesting involve different ways of slicing and dicing the light rays, like after the fact. So refocusing is saying, okay, we've got this very small 4-dimensional raster of light rays. If we bend them in different ways, we can actually generate different 2-dimensional images out of them, right? 2-dimensional slices of this 4D raster. When we start talking about large-scale light fields, and my interest in them is much more around like arbitrary perspective generation. And sorry, this gets a little wonky, but if you're in a VR headset or an AR headset and you're wandering around, you want to be able to deliver different perspectives to people on the fly. If you have all the light rays separate, you can actually infer what someone would have seen and sort of give them a realistic view from that. So arbitrary perspective generation, holographic imaging to actually kind of make it a little more user-friendly, like the ability to deliver multiple perspectives instead of like a flat image on a poster.
So when you spoke at SF Video, my only frame of reference for light fields vaguely was what I'd heard from Adam Brown, one of my colleagues that used to work at Otoy. He had mentioned it at one point, I'm sure, in the past. But I think my perspective, and I'm sure a lot of other consumers generally, is like Lytro. Things like Lytro are the only exposure that people have to something, the concept of light fields. So how does that relate to this conversation, like Lytro cameras and things like that?
Yeah, I mean, Lytro, I think, really deserves credit for bringing the idea into the masses, right? And their first application of light fields was that refocusing camera. Not exactly a commercial success, but definitely like a very interesting application of this sort of idea. And the reason they started out with these refocusing cameras, frankly, is because it's what they could do. Light fields had been sort of an academic curiosity for a long time. They've sort of like bubbled up in the public consciousness a few times. Refocusing cameras was the first. Lytro retooled recently, like about 2015, and started focusing on VR more and sort of professional cinema applications. And these are like just expanding on more things you can do when you start to, have these very large rasters of rays. I think if we want to cut through the jargon and just like misapply some terms, it's holographic imaging, right? It's ways of creating things that are like way more realistic than two-dimensional images, and that's super exciting. So
you mentioned like a cinema use case,
yeah. So Lytro's other branch of research is not just on VR and AR. It's on kind of improved imaging for the cinematic market. You can think of it as their refocusing camera on ridiculous steroids. I don't know if you've seen pictures of this. It made some news. It'd be 2016. They had this 755 megapixel, 300 frame a second crazy camera thing that they built, crazy custom optics, lenses and so on. So they kind of have two product lines right now. That's their big cinema that's meant for traditional 2D cinema. And then they have their Emerge, which is more for VR and AR.
Is the customer use case there that somebody on a movie set could be using this camera to capture the film, but then later in post-processing they decide, oh, you know what, I didn't like that angle perfectly, I didn't like that focus, and they could actually be almost moving the camera person around in space after the fact?
Yeah, they can do some amount of kind of physically moving where the point of perspective is. This all kind of traces back to the fact that you're just picking different light rays to generate an image, right? And so in a refocusing scenario, you're sort of rebinning the rays, so there's a different implied focal plane. In the more cinematic applications, they have really powerful ways of, changing the F number of the taking lens, or slightly moving the perspective, or doing depth matting. I think these are a few of the features they've shown off. But it all ties back to that. You have these rays that haven't been kind of summed together, so you can pick them apart and do interesting stuff with them. I don't think we really even scratched the surface of what that means. They've done some things that are physically impossible to capture. They've demonstrated imagery from the equivalent of an f.3 lens, I think was one of the numbers, which is just physically impossible to do.
What is f.3?
So the f number on a lens is sort of like the ratio of the aperture to the focal length. That's the nerdy definition of it. But what it really relates to is how narrow is the depth of field. Right, and it turns out there's physical limits on kind of how many light rays you can gather together and make a sharp image. But if you keep the light rays separate, you can sort of arbitrarily mathematically bend them in ways that are optically impossible. And so they're really sort of pushing the boundaries of what's possible in two-dimensional imaging by starting out with light fields, which is interesting. And frankly, it's I think it's a transitional case for light fields. I think that's interesting. The reason I started Visby was not to go make better 2D images. It's more what can light fields do as displays start to change? Because to me, this is all about future displays. VR is the first. We're going to get augmented reality in some form or another. And I think eventually these TVs are all going to be multi-perspective.
And that Lytro camera is an insanely expensive piece of hardware kit, right? We're talking,
I mean, yeah, you have to fund a company with a bunch of money to get one of them.
Yeah,
I believe it's a $200 million company camera or something like that. No, I mean it's hardcore R&D, right? They're spending the money to kind of figure these things out for the first time. My understanding is, I hear through the grapevine that they're working on miniaturizing it and making it cheaper and kind of getting it out to. I don't think it's gonna be mass market. I think it's gonna be a very specialized piece of kit, but something that's not a one-off that shows up in its own truck. Right. Fun company to pay attention to, and they're doing lots of cool stuff.
How does this play into the AR, VR, 360 space? Where's the commonality? Where's the difference? We're all very used to now, we weren't maybe 12 months ago, but now we're all very used to talking about, Vive headsets and that sort of thing. And where we see, 3D generated worlds and, some very rudimentary captured, AR, VR video, I can't remember the right word, but the hemispherical produced piece of content with a kind of a static point of view. How does this play into that then? How does this change what AR looks like?
Yeah, so I think the background is VR right now, which is kind of in market, is basically just a video game technology. And all the hype, the deflation of the hype cycle, I think is people starting to realize all the projections around how transformative VR can be really rely on it being something other than a video game peripheral. And we haven't yet seen that happen. But the imaging chain is based on video game stack, basically. If you want to go working it, you're working in Unity, you're working in Unreal. The basic unit of visual information is a polygon, right? And that's fine. And then alongside that, you have 360 video, right? The equirectangular, whatever. We're abusing 2D video tools to wrap them around someone's head. It's still fundamentally a 2D technology, right? You can look all around, but it's just a sphere around your head, right? Maybe it's a stereosphere if you're really fancy. That doesn't really unlock the power of these displays, though, right? The power of these displays is you can like walk around and see new perspectives and really feel like you're in a place. And the problem with the polygon approach, the video game peripherals, is things look like a video game. So the way light fields fit in here is they have the promise to give you that positional tracking. So you can walk around and see new perspectives and feel like you're in a place, but actually give you something that's photographically correct, not just kind of a bad early 2000s video game. And the reason we can do that is we're not necessarily representing the shape of the scene, which is photographically deficient, right? The shape is one thing, but we actually want to know how light interacts with the shape. And so if you have all of the light rays, then you don't need to worry about the shape. You just deliver the light rays that someone would have seen, and it should, in theory, be totally photorealistic. In practice, we're not quite there yet. This is one of those like future technologies, but it's really necessary. Otherwise, all these things are just going to be, will remain video game peripherals. And I think in your guys' first episode, you're like, is VR the thing that's going to die in 2 years? Like, is this like the next hype cycle? So not if light fields come along. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, my 3D TV is just good for accidentally getting turned on and being blurry. And I can't. We finally had to remove it from our Harmony remote because we kept accidentally bumping it on the couch. And then like, why does this look like such shit? Oh, right.
Yes.
It was literally only ever good for 2-player video games with different screens. Literally the only good thing.
It'd be awkward to share a VR headset that way. So this is not potentially less useful.
Like, we can't do this with existing VR headsets, right? We're going to have to come up with a different display technology for this as well, right?
Well, okay,
Or are we going to be able to use the same display hardware and just do some very cool stuff with what we captured from light field to render it?
So my company's in the process of proving that today's display technology can actually handle light fields. We've got a little demo, which unfortunately can't show you guys today because I traveled light. But we have a demo that runs on a laptop. Yeah.
Minor detail.
Yeah. But no, we've got something running on an Oculus, and it is photorealistic, and it is 6-degree freedom. Still very early days, but it can be done. There's just a lot more work to do before it's kind of commercially viable. But it does work. I mean, these displays can draw 2 million pixels, which end up being light rays poured into your eye, and on the fly, if you are clever, you can generate the light rays that came from the real world and give someone the right view. So I think these are functionally holographic displays, right? They're capable of giving you 6 degree of freedom imagery. It's just that the software stack is way behind. And that's kind of what Visby's working on. It's part of what Lightro's working on. It's what Otoy's working on. And there's a few other companies. I wouldn't say it's a race. I'd say that we're all trying to figure out what it's going to take to get these things to be practical. There's a series of pretty tough technical challenges that still have to be tackled.
Yes, so I think I understand. So the promise here is that basically like something that feels like a VR video game, but it's real life, right? Like you're actually looking at real images. What needs to happen? Because as the demos that I've seen around light field have been in one place, like, and so the camera's set up in one place, and you can move your head around where you are. You can maybe move as much as like a few feet. What needs to happen to where you can actually like walk around in an environment?
So this brings up a really good point. I think that light fields are really critical for the future, but they're not going to be the entire future. There are advantages to having a polygon representation of the world or a point cloud representation, and being able to walk around anywhere you want is actually one of the big advantages of polygons.
Okay.
Because if you know the shape of an object, you can now synthesize a view of it from any direction. A pure light field approach in which you're actually sampling light rays and then trying to rebin them and draw perspectives from them, you have to actually capture the light rays in the first place. So you're actually limited by the physical extent of your capture device. How many cameras do you have wired together, basically. So if you want someone to be able to walk around a whole room, you'd sort of be stuck having to put cameras around the edges of the room. And that's possible. And we've been playing around with that. We were talking to an equipment company yesterday about how many cameras can we pack in a small space and what would that look like. But when you start to have those kind of conversations, it's very clear that there's sort of a limit to how physically far you can go. Now, I think it's worth it if you can bring the real world in and it looks realistic, right? You're not limited by the subject matter. You're not only shooting on green screens. You're not only, filming like very, very carefully lit subjects, but you can say, let's go transport someone to somewhere in the real world and have it look good. But by the way, if you take more than 2 steps in any direction, everything breaks. So I think it's kind of going to be the trade-off.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So what hardware are you using right now? Like, what does your capture setup
Oh, it's
look
incredibly embarrassing. We're a minimally funded startup, so we're using a bunch of knockoff GoPros. That's not a nice way to describe it. The Xiaoyi action camera, they're actually better than GoPros, but they're cheaper. Therefore, they look inferior, but no, they're fantastic. You can synchronize them all. But they're like $200 cameras. So we have 50 of them in a big grid. And, so it's effectively a 100 megapixel imager. That part sounds pretty cool. But I am wrangling 50 tiny micro SD cards at a time. So it feels like a big step back.
So definitely consumer ready is what you're saying.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah. There'll be a sign up link. I can send you guys. You guys can order 50 cameras at a time and wire them together yourselves. You're ready to go.
You just need 50 SD card readers or
patience and tweezers, and you're good to go. Yeah.
Got it.
The workflow is awesome.
So what do you see as the most exciting use cases in the future for?
So I'm gonna go crazy on you here. I think in 10 years it's all gonna be light fields. Everything. I think our TV is going to be holographic. I think that your phone's going to have these holographic displays, and I think the entire signal chain is going to have to be multi-perspective. The display hardware is actually getting there. I've seen stuff behind closed doors of holographic panels that are really convincing. Nothing commercially available yet, but it's coming. And I think unlike 3D TV, a holographic panel is going to be a big upgrade. People are going to want to be able to hang a window on their wall that they can tune into different places, right? So that's the long-term crazy thought. Everything's going to go holographic, and at that point, all the work that's gone into these 2D codecs are going to have to go into these 4-dimensional codecs and light field codecs, and that's where I started getting intimidated about how much work there remains to be done. Oh my God, there's so much to do. We're like the barely baby steps right now. Hey, we got 30 frames to play back on a laptop with a GTX 1080 in it. We're there. It's no, we can't capture, we can't stream, we can't edit. There's so many things to do still. So 10 years is not a long time. We've got to get to work. So I don't know if that's a satisfying answer or not, but that's the big idea, I think.
Yeah, well, you touched on something there that's kind of interesting. What does it look like? So if everything's light field, what does the lean back experience look like? If you're sitting on the couch, how does that impact? I can understand you've got the VR goggles on.
Right.
How does it impact you're sitting on the couch and you're looking at something that supports light field up on the wall?
So I think it may look like a minor improvement over a lot of lean back entertainment today. The main advantage will just be that we'll seem really real, right? And it sounds minor, but even the tiny bit of perspective change as you shift around slightly makes it feel like you're not looking at a flat image anymore. And we don't really appreciate how much mental training has gone into understanding a 2D image as an image and trying to transport yourself there. None of that cognitive load is involved when you're looking at a holographic image. You really feel like you're looking through a window, and it feels very natural. That could be pleasant or unpleasant. I don't think I want to watch horror films that way. But even minor movements actually give you a really strong sense of depth, much more than just stereopsis. It turns out that the tiny micro movements, we're seeing how objects shift relative to one another, tiny amounts of parallax. When those are correlated with our proprioception, it feels really real. So, short of, I'm not sure if I can verbalize it, but trust me, when you experience it, it's a different level entirely. So I think it's just things are going to look better, right? It's going to be it's not as easy to convey as when television went from black and white to color, but it might be a similar upgrade in perceptual quality.
This is a really dumb example, but we try and get our dog to use FaceTime, and she has no idea what's going on. You can tell, she can't tell what the image actually is, and so I wonder with light field if it actually looked real.
Should be closer. I mean, she's probably way more interested if it smelled like you. Unfortunately, her experience of the world is probably a bit different, but yeah.
So I had a note that I wanted to ask about how this is going to affect cinematography in the future. And I think we're already kind of touching on that a little bit, but what comes to mind is the jump from 30 FPS to 60 FPS, and how it kind of feels, at least in my opinion, I kind of hate it. I hate the, I call it
the soap opera look.
I didn't coin this phrase. I'm sure somebody else did. Yeah, the soap opera effect that you have on TVs that upscale it, and it can make otherwise good actors just look terrible. Because everything looks more real, you judge everything a lot more. So do you see similar things happening with this? This feels like the next level of that. And then on top of that, so my other question would be, I've heard some people say that they see one of the benefits of light field for cinematographers is similar to what people see as the real benefit of 360 video, where it's if you have 360 degrees of capture, you have more freedom with what you do with your camera. So like if I'm snowboarding with a 360 degree camera on my head, I don't have to worry about looking at all the interesting things. I can edit the video later to capture what's cool.
Yeah, you mean like a two-dimensional cutout from the 360?
Right,
Okay,
exactly.
all right.
So I've heard people say similar things about light fields. Is you have more freedom later to go in and adjust the perspective a little bit from a director's.
So those are two very complex questions. Let me tackle the cinematography one first. I think that on sets in general, and this is just anecdotal conversations I've had, there has been some heartburn from on-set directors of photography, and lighting DPs, and so on about the number of choices and creative choices that are actually made in post-production, right? Color, I think, is the most recent, where color decisions used to be baked in either on, basically on how you expose the film or how you painted it into, a camera system that wasn't raw. Now that decision is being deferred to post when a colorist might be making these decisions who wasn't on set and the DP's not there. I think there's a little unease and some risk around light fields that a lot of the decisions you would normally make, what we consider the art of cinematography, is now being completely deferred to the user, right? How do you frame the shot, the perspective, the framing is, it's closer to theater where the blocking actually determines the action than cinematography, where the frame directs your attention because it's not a 2D medium anymore. Now, I think there's always uncertainty around new technology, and there's some people who are diving in and really excited, but we still don't know what the language is going to look like. And I would be perfectly comfortable if people didn't want to call it cinematography anymore. It's a very different discipline. The creative language hasn't really been formulated yet. That's punting a bit, but in truth, I think there's a lot of work to do on the creative side. And to address the first question, I actually had a deep conversation with a friend about 120 frame a second shooting. I don't know if, I haven't seen it yet, but apparently Billy Lynn's Long Halftime Walk, Ang Lee's latest film, shot 120 frame a second, stereo 4K, and people said it radically changed acting. And the theory is now we're at high enough frame rates at that point that you can actually, all the like tiny subconscious cues you get in how people's faces move, you actually pick up on these tiny micro expressions that are incredibly telling, and it changes the art of acting. And so I think what we're seeing is this isn't just an extension to cinematography or an extension to sort of traditional filmmaking. It's kind of a new discipline, and it's going to take us a few years of fumbling around to figure it out. I should say though, I don't think it's going to be like some hybrid of video games. Not like, it's all going to be interactive now. Like people have been talking about interactive stuff for 20 years, and it's never really quite panned out. I think people like lean back entertainment. So, but yeah, it'll change everything. That can be good, it can be bad.
So what does this mean for the video industry as a whole? We've got file formats now, we've got delivery technologies, we know how to do what we're doing now. Is that all completely changed? Is it just a fundamental disruption we're going to see over the next 10 years?
The two are going to live alongside each other for quite a while. And I should say there's going to be some extensions on top of 2D video that will sort of bring it in these new mediums. I'm hearing a lot of people talking about RGB plus depth, ways of augmenting traditional 2D images so they've got a little bit of depth to them so someone can move around a tiny bit. I haven't seen a great implementation of it, but I think that's going to live kind of at the low end and be a transitional format for a long time. So I would say that in traditional video chains, there's going to be a lot of grafting stuff on to support these new media. At the same time, the light fields and volumetric approaches and these sort of new holographic approaches are so raw that there's going to be a lot of work where people take the lessons learned over the last 20 years of online video and start applying it to these new representations. The challenge is the data formats themselves are radically different. People are playing around with form a whole lot, but literally the way images are represented in bytes is changing completely. Now there has been work on polygon compression kind of in the video game industry already, so you may see that. You may see people having to kind of like hybridize a bit, start to get smart about that stuff. On the light field side, I'd say it's just still in the realm of like PhD math right now. So I think eventually you get to the point where formats are locked and people can start to do real things on top of it, but it's pretty hard to move that ball forward for a little while.
I think formats is a really interesting one to talk about, right? I was at a MPEG meeting about 12 months ago now, where there was initial talk about trying to come up with some sort of codec for, light field representation of data. Do you know about where that's got to? Like, what are you using to represent light field data, and is there going to an industry standard here?
Yeah, I can't talk in detail about how we're representing light fields for two really important reasons. One is that it's a bit of trade secret, and the other one is that I don't understand it at all. It's completely over my head. So I'm not going to mess things up by trying to give you a garbled version of it. In terms of the standards bodies, though, I can say this. I think we're still at the very early days when people are trying to agree on terminology. And if you look at some of the proposals that are out there, the JPEG Plano working group's doing a lot of good stuff, and they're sort of broadcasting some ideas. There's some MPEG working group. VRIF, I think, is meeting in December, which we may be attending. But we're still at the phase where everyone's kind of throwing everything at the wall and see what's going to stick, because there's nothing around light fields anyway that's practical yet. And I think whatever becomes practical may well lead the way towards a standard. But all the proposals right now are a grab bag. They're saying like, well, we should support point clouds and polygon-based approaches and light field rasters. And I think if you just look at the proposals, I don't see anything on the light field side that's ready for prime time. Now, we think our representation can be made quite small. We've got some early proof of concept. That, by the way, is the big barrier. You want to get light fields into like some sort of workable standard, you have to have some way to compress it down. The data rates we're talking about, in theory, an uncompressed light field is like petabytes in size. So how do you deal with that? And as soon as someone gets it to work, I think that's going to probably be the first down payment on a standard. But don't hold your breath. I don't think it's going to be hashed out in an MPEG meeting in the next 2 months.
So that was actually a big question that I was going to ask is, to Phil's point, we kind of know how to work with the formats that we have today. So like throwing a new format into the mix isn't the end of the world. But we're already, with the explosion of video on the internet in general, in some places we're already kind of starting to test the edges of our current network capacity already. Yeah. So all of a sudden, if we're talking, 10xing, 20xing, 30xing, what we're delivering, and the infrastructure hasn't caught up there yet, what does that even mean? Like, what are we talking about here in terms of, say we can get some sort of standard? Like, what do you think the lower bounds of file size and what we're delivering looks like there?
We haven't found the bottom yet, but I can tell you we're aiming for 100 megabit, which is incredibly aggressive, for a good high-resolution, multi-megapixel light field. I think we're going to hit it. We've got a great team. We're working really hard at it, and we've seen really good progress, and we're on track for it. But we're still not ready to come to market with it yet. I think at 100 megabit, it will work with today's infrastructure. If it's significantly above that, I was talking to someone who's big in the industry who's saying 500 megabit is his lower bound for practical applications. And if you can't get to there, it's just a curiosity. It's never going to make it to market. So, I guess to punt, the answer is somewhere between 100 and 500 megabit is required. And until we get there, it's going to remain a curiosity. But I think we'll be there within a year. Now, that's my aggressive projection. We'll be there within a year.
So realistically, this isn't going to be over IP for a long time, right? Maybe 100 megabit. I mean, how much of the world is connected at 100 megabit? Not a huge amount outside of major build-up areas, right? Maybe in 10 years, yeah, maybe. I think it's going to be challenging, right?
Yeah, I mean, so how many people have high-end VR headsets that can even use a light field right now? I mean, it's we're still at the foundational stages. We are keeping our eye on 5G. I think at the point where we can stream over, next-gen cell networks, and fortunately install base on phones turns over really quickly. So we may see realistic bandwidth down to the consumer jumping up a lot in the next 2-3 years, I think. I know there's been a big push behind that rollout. So I wouldn't say we're counting on 5G, but we're hopeful. I mean, to frame this a bit, 100 megabit is insane. I just want to say that right off the bat. There's no way we should be talking about that. An uncompressed light field is completely preposterously large, and we're not dealing with pixel-based formats anymore, right? I think that's a sort of an interesting technical point the audience may appreciate. There is a ground truth when you're dealing with a 2D video. You look at an uncompressed video, you know that you've got some raster, they got some value at each raster point. True light fields are actually could be perspective free or arbitrary perspective. You can't require the VR user to be standing on a grid and exactly turn their head in 0.1 degree increments or something, right? Think about any arbitrary angle. And so you've got this almost analog space. The data space is so large if you want to be high fidelity. So it's, we've made some breakthroughs at Visby where we feel we can get down to 100 megabit, and that alone, we should be celebrating.
So for reference here, so some people, to try to improve delivery of 360 video, for example, they try to guess where your head's going, encode your field of vision, and then maybe encode like a little bit around it, and then just keep up with your head movement. Sounds like that's such a minor, in comparison with what we're talking about now, that is such a small optimization. And it doesn't even sound like that concept.
Well, there has to be an adaptive bitrate version of this, right? So you have to have some way in which you can sort of spend your bits where you think someone's going to look. For sure, that's going to be an issue. We're still at the stage where people are worrying about representation. So we're keeping in mind that we're going to want to do adaptive bitrate streaming and some sort of prediction as we build this thing out. But that's probably 2 steps away from now, to be frank. Our goal is to get something that someone can download overnight and watch a beautiful cinematic experience at home and feel like, okay, that's a really important milestone. The next step would be, okay, I can I can stream it, and after a little bit of buffering, watch it. And then I think a few years from now, we're going to be at the point where someone wants to be live streaming, set up cameras, and live stream it out to end clients. That might be 5 years away, to be completely honest.
I think that's a really exciting prospect, right? Like getting to a true live streaming experience for this. I'd love the idea of being able to watch watch Glastonbury, but through like a light field camera where I can then kind of move around, look around and stuff. I think that would be an amazing use of the technology.
Yeah, well, it's on our roadmap. It's unfortunately a few years off, so sit tight. We actually believe there's going to have to be a change in kind of camera technology before that's possible. One of the big challenges you have if you've got a 50 camera or 200 camera array is the raw data coming off those cameras is just so much to process. It's just really hard to see it getting to real time anyway soon. So we have some IP around ways to reconfigure cameras that might make it easier to do these things, but that's an R&D project for us.
How distributable is that kind of workload? If you've got some form of stream coming off of, say, a grid of 50, 100 cameras, right? You have to presumably can do some level of parallel post-processing on that, but at some point it's got to get down to like one data stream, right?
We haven't really invested in saying, oh, you got 200 cameras. How can we, pull all this data into one pipe and then start to reshuffle it so it can be processed quickly? The way we handle light fields, I don't want to like edge into trade secret territory, but it's highly parallelizable, right? You could, in theory, just throw a ton of parallel compute at the thing, and maybe you squint and conclude we could get close to real time. But the whole thing just feels so impractical that we're not investing in that part of it yet. I think there are other breakthroughs that'll make it a lot easier. So again, I think it's a 5-year timeline for that. Yeah, that's as far as I'll go on that one. How's that?
Cool. Nice. No, absolutely. It's fascinating.
I think the interesting point of reference here for coming from like the traditional transcoding, delivery, playback world, when we're talking about 100 megabit being kind of the lower end of phenomenal that we can expect, like if we're getting there and everybody's able to handle it, then do we even need to encode content anymore? Are we just like shoving ProRes files straight down the pipe to people? Like at that point, like, how many transcoding businesses are going to go out of business if we don't, like, if file size does not matter in the traditional sense?
Well, the other way of looking at it is that like consumer expectations are going to get higher, resolutions are going to go up. So relative advantage is always powerful.
The sweet 16K video. I mean,
yeah, right. Yeah. Well, and if you look at proposals for 360, I should say I'm a crazy outlier. Okay, I mean the stuff I'm talking about is nuts compared to I think where the center of mass of conversation in the VR industry is today. So if you look at what most people are talking about, they're talking about, well, it'd be great when we get to like 20K 2D video that we can make, into stereo or whatever. So, there are still people talking about these preposterously high resolutions for kind of traditional pixel-based images. And that might be part of the mix. I think that plus some amount of depth augmenting will be important. So all the hardcore algorithms people are using to compress, 2D rasters right now will be repurposed and augmented and be really important. I mean, if we want to get to live streaming Glastonbury, in 2 years, there's half a dozen companies working on that right now, sitting on top of the existing video stack and doing extensions to it. So I think that might be where the real heat and light is for the next couple of years.
Great.
It's important that I not say that everyone who's listening to this, your job is irrelevant in 5 years, right? You don't want to like, thank you very much.
I know what I'm retraining in now.
Would it be possible in the future that we record one of these podcasts using light field?
How many hard drives do you have?
We have the cloud.
Yeah, well, there you go. Perfect. As long as your app is big enough, we can take care of it. Actually, last shoot we did, the way we moved the data to the clouds, we got one of those snowball appliances. You know?
Oh yeah, the Amazon ones.
Yeah. So give you some idea of the data we're talking about here. It's not small, but it'd be fun. It would be a lot of fun, wouldn't it? Right now, us getting a shoot together is still a bit of a chore. But I've got an engineer, contract engineer, working on just like wiring things together, so I don't curse the world and all of my poor career choices every time I decide to go shoot something. So probably like a couple months, that won't be like an impossible ask.
Cool. That'd be fun.
Yeah, it'd be a lot of fun. It's kind of intimidating to stare at 50 lenses, by the way. It's like something to get used to. Is like, yeah.
I can't wait for this to be like the action cam, somebody going down a mountain on a snowboard with 50 cameras strapped to their back.
I have to say, actually, speaking of poor career choices, I actually used to strap a digital cinema camera to my chest and ride an electric mountain bike down slopes to produce video content for the fitness industry. So I have been there. I have crashed with hundreds of pounds of video equipment, like cabled in and taped to my body, and it's not very pleasant. So that's why I now just record podcasts and talk about technology.
That video is going to be available on Demuxed.com.
Actually, it was my first VR content I created was taking some of that footage and playing it back in a VR headset. Far and away the most nauseating thing I think I've ever experienced.
Yeah.
So
no thanks on that one.
yeah.
Something that did occur in my mind was, do we think this is going to give more ability for tweaking to the end user? So like one of the things that I've seen a lot more of is kind of picking your own like experience, right? Like there are websites out there like giving people the ability to pick particular pieces of the orchestra they want to hear more clearly, or, you know, down mixing how they want to on the client end. Is this going to open that sort of window for cinematography? Like, am I going to be able to kind of realistically like play with the brightness I see and the contrast and the color space I see, do we think?
Yeah, I mean, so in theory, you could do that with 2D video right now, right? You could give an end user, you know, some sort of LUT control, and they could change what they see. The thing that it opens up that's not possible is that, you know, the end client really is the cinematographer, right? They're the ones who are choosing the framing and where they're looking and so on. And, you know, to be honest, I think that there are some mixed feelings about that in the sort of traditional cinematography community. And they're saying like, well, how do I direct someone's attention to the subject matter if they're staring off in the corner somewhere? So I don't think we've really figured out the language for that. So it's a double-edged sword, right? Yes, there's a ton of control on the end client side. You know, we're not really sure how to use that, right? And there's some really kind of like experiments in formalism right now, I'd say, where people are, you know, turning out the lights or doing things to really manipulate attention, and it has that feel of like train pulling into the station kind of stuff. Like we're just trying to understand what the boundaries are and what the new language is. I should say also though, like to the extent this is going to be interactive, I'm a big skeptic. I think there's going to be a clear divide between video games and, for lack of a better word, called cinematic content. And there'll be some formal experiments in the middle, and maybe someone finds a model there that works. But I think there's a reason that, like, you know, the touchstone for the interactive narrative is like choose your own adventure books, which aren't exactly, you know, there's a reason that those aren't a raging success still, right? I mean, it's a quirk. It's a weird thing.
Yeah, we were at a VR meetup the other day, and they brought up an example. The same discussion here is like how are you going to deal with this option for people to look around and make their own story, and like. They pointed to an example where somebody had basically like if you're looking straight, you see this couple who looks like happy and they're you know, in a good place, but then if you look around, you're actually in this like drab apartment and like it's in squalor, and you get like more of the story. It's hard. I haven't seen the example myself, but this is what they were describing. It made a lot of sense that it's like, oh, okay, so you can actually start to like inform if you do it right, you could maybe inform the story by allowing the person to look around more, as opposed to just being like a freedom thing.
Right, like layer on context.
Yeah.
Which is pretty cool.
Yeah, that's a good point, actually. So I'm already going to contradict myself here, just because, I don't know, that leads to an interesting thought, which is the one change we have now is we actually have, for free, knowledge of where the user is looking. Right, that's actually the structural change. And so it's possible, some of the formal experimentation that's been done, I think the first I was aware of was the Wild VR experience. Very subtle. I didn't realize it was true, but it was a branching narrative based on where you happen to be looking. And again, because the SDK includes your gaze direction, you can do that invisibly. Whereas I think it's really hokey if it's like, hey, here's a button. Do you want the person to go right or go left? Do you want the person to, you know, open a cabinet or shoot a gun? You know, like it doesn't feel like a narrative. But if it's really subtle, then it feels like you're just watching a narrative. You don't know it's interactive. The downside is you don't know it's interactive, right? So is the experience actually any different than watching a simple linear narrative? You have no idea. If you're really into it and you go back and rewatch it and it's different, that's interesting, but it's sort of meta interesting, right? It doesn't actually change the viewed experience. So as I dive into this muddle, you can see like, this is kind of where we are, right? It's like people have theories and they're experimenting and, train pulling into the station, It was fun to watch.
This has been fascinating. I didn't know if I was just going to, I thought about watching the podcast again so I could ask really awesome watch the meetup again and ask really awesome informed question. But this was awesome. It was a lot of new information from from the meetup itself. So if you're interested in this and you want to see Ryan's talk at SF Video, you can find it on YouTube under the Heavybit library. Just look up Demuxed and Ryan Damm. I'm sure it'll come up eventually. But
yeah, it's the only one I know of. So
yeah. But thanks again, Ryan. This is really great.
Thanks for having me. It's a fun conversation.
That's all we have for today, but as always, we'd love to hear what you thought, even if you disagree, so please reach out on Twitter at Demuxed.
To learn more about Heavybit, visit heavybit.com. And while you're there, be sure to check out their library. It's packed with amazing talks on sales, marketing, product, and general management from founders of developer tools companies and other industry leaders.